The HOA sent me a map showing a road through my ranch that had never legally existed. I thought Patricia Monroe wanted me to move an old cattle fence. Then blue survey paint appeared 20 feet inside my Texas ranch. A fake 30-foot corridor showed up on an HOA map, and somebody started moving my boundary markers. I built one new fence exactly where the law said it belonged, and that's when their real plan began showing through. What we uncovered went far beyond neighborhood rules. If you enjoy stories where ordinary landowners stay calm, follow the evidence, and stand their ground legally, subscribe and stay with me. Because the reason they needed my land was something Patricia never expected me to uncover. The first thing I noticed was the paint. Bright blue, fresh, wrong. It was sprayed across the dry grass about 20 feet inside my eastern pasture. A sharp line of color where there should have been nothing but cedar roots, cattle tracks, and dust. I stopped beside the old fence and stared at it. My name is Wade Mercer. I'm 48 years old, and I've lived on this 340-acre ranch in Texas my whole life. My father, Thomas Mercer, used to say a boundary only mattered if the man standing beside it respected what it meant. He'd been dead 3 years, but I still heard his voice every time I checked a fence line. Don't assume. Measure. So I measured. I walked back to the nearest corner post, pulled a steel tape from the toolbox in my pickup, and ran it toward the blue mark, 19 feet, 8 inches. Then another mark, 20 feet, 2 inches. Then another. Whoever had done this wasn't guessing. They'd laid out a line. I followed it north for nearly 300 yards before it disappeared behind a stand of cedar. That was when the unease started. Cedar Ridge Estates sat beyond my eastern boundary, a development of clean stucco houses and trimmed lawns that had gone up over the last 6 years. I had nothing against the people living there. Most of them waved when I drove past. Some brought their kids to watch the calves in spring, but their HOA had no business on Mercer land. None. My deed predated the subdivision by decades. The old fence had stood in the same general line since before Cedar Ridge had streets. I took pictures of every blue mark, including wide shots that showed the fence, the pasture, and the distance between them. Then I drove back to the house. I had just finished pouring coffee when a white SUV turned off the county road and rolled toward my gate. The woman who stepped out looked like she had dressed for a board meeting, not a ranch. Pressed blouse, dark slacks, sunglasses, leather folder tucked under one arm. She didn't wait for me to invite her closer. "Mr. Mercer?" I set the coffee mug on this porch rail. "That depends who's asking." She removed her sunglasses. "Patricia Monroe, president of Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association." That name I knew. I'd seen it printed on mailed notices about landscaping changes and community meetings that had nothing to do with me. She smiled like we were about to discuss something minor. "We're reviewing the eastern perimeter for maintenance compliance." I looked past her toward the pasture. "You mean the blue paint?" Her smile tightened. "So you've seen it. Hard to miss." She opened the leather folder and pulled out a glossy sheet. "Our survey contractor identified a possible discrepancy between the historical fence placement and the community maintenance corridor." I didn't take the paper. "What community maintenance corridor?" "The one running along the western edge of Cedar Ridge." "You mean my eastern pasture?" She paused. "Potentially." That one word changed the conversation. I stepped down from the porch. "Patricia, that fence is on my property. We're not saying it isn't. You just said I may have to move it. We're saying the current placement may interfere with a recorded access area." "Recorded where?" She gave me the kind of patient look people use when they think they've already won. "We're still verifying the documents. Then why did somebody mark my land before verifying anything?" For the first time, she hesitated. Only for a second. "Our contractor was authorized to conduct preliminary measurements." "Authorized by who?" "The association." That wasn't my question. Her jaw tightened. I pointed toward the gate. "You don't authorize people to survey inside my ranch." She closed the folder. "Mr. Mercer, there's no reason to make this adversarial. I didn't put blue paint 20 feet inside somebody else's property. She held my gaze. Then she said it. Old fences aren't always legal fences, Mr. Mercer. The line was calm, almost polite. That made it worse. I thought about my father resetting posts after a flood when I was 12. Thought about him showing me the iron markers buried near the corner line. Thought about the old deed locked in the fireproof safe inside my office. Patricia kept talking. If the review confirms the corridor, the fence may need to be relocated. We'd rather handle it cooperatively. How far? She glanced toward the pasture, approximately 20 feet in some sections. There it was, the same distance as the paint. Not a guess, not a possibility, a plan. I looked back at her. You should leave. Her expression cooled. I'd encourage you not to make any permanent changes until you receive formal notice. That's interesting. Why? Because this is my ranch. I don't need your permission to change anything on it. She put her sunglasses back on. We'll be in touch, I figured. She walked to her SUV and drove out without another word. I waited until the dust settled before going back inside. Then I opened the safe. The deed was where it always was. So were the tax maps, the old title documents, and a yellowing sketch my father had kept folded inside a plastic sleeve. I spread them across the table. Nothing showed a 30-foot road. Nothing showed a community corridor. Nothing showed Cedar Ridge owning so much as a blade of grass inside my pasture, but Patricia hadn't looked uncertain. That bothered me. People bluff differently when they're guessing. She wasn't guessing. By late afternoon, I was back at the eastern fence. The wind pushed softly through the cedar, and the old wire gave a faint metallic rattle. I stood beside one of the blue marks and looked toward the rooftops of Cedar Ridge rising beyond the line. The question wasn't whether my fence was legal. I already knew whose land I was standing on. The question was why an HOA that owned nothing on my side of the boundary had already paid somebody to survey 20 feet of it. 3 days later, I got my answer, or at least the version Patricia Monroe wanted me to believe. The certified envelope was waiting in my mailbox when I came back from checking cattle. Across the top, in bold letters, it read, Boundary Correction and Safety Compliance Order. I read it standing beside my pickup. Cedar Ridge Estates claimed my eastern fence interfered with a community service lane required for drainage maintenance and emergency access. According to the notice, I had 21 days to relocate more than 1,000 feet of fencing. If I refused, the association reserved the right to seek appropriate judicial enforcement. I read that sentence twice. An HOA I didn't belong to was threatening to take me to court for refusing to move a fence on land they didn't own. Then I reached the last page. It was a glossy aerial map. Cedar Ridge sat on the right. Mercer Ranch sat on the left. Between them was a shaded strip labeled 30 Community Service Lane. The strip ran straight through my pasture. I carried the packet inside and laid Patricia's map beside my father's records. They didn't match, not even close. The old documents showed a narrow notation near the subdivision drainage culvert, but nothing resembling Patricia's 30-foot lane. I could have called her. Instead, I called Harold Bennett. Harold had spent more than 40 years surveying land in the county before retirement. More importantly, he'd worked on Cedar Ridge's original subdivision plat. When I told him what Patricia had sent, he went quiet. Bring me the map. An hour later, my pickup was parked outside Harold's small workshop on the edge of town. He spread Patricia's drawing across a drafting table and pinned the corners with coffee mugs. Then I handed him the old county documents. Harold put on his glasses. For the next several minutes, he said nothing. His finger moved between the two maps. Finally, he tapped Patricia's version. Where'd they get this? Came with the order. That's not what I asked. I looked at him. Harold pulled an old plat book from a cabinet and opened it across the table. This is the recorded Cedar Ridge plat. The paper was faded, but the lines were clear. He pointed to the subdivision boundary, then to Mercer Ranch. then to a narrow strip beside the drainage culvert. There, I leaned closer. A notation identified a 14-foot easement. What exactly does that give them? Emergency drainage access. Enough room to reach the culvert if storm debris blocks it. Road access? No. Construction traffic. No. 30 feet? Harold gave me a dry look. 14 was still 14 last time I checked. For the first time since Patricia had appeared at my gate, I felt the pressure ease, only slightly, because Harold wasn't smiling. He placed Patricia's map directly over the recorded plat and aligned two fixed corners. The difference became obvious. Their shaded corridor swallowed the legitimate drainage easement, then expanded west across another 16 feet of my ranch. Worse, it continued farther north than the recorded easement did. This isn't just wider, I said. No, they extended it. Looks that way. I stared at the map. Could this be a drafting mistake? Harold removed his glasses. Wade, I've seen survey mistakes. Numbers get transposed. Bearings get copied wrong. Somebody works from an outdated reference. He tapped the glossy sheet. This isn't that. How can you tell? Because whoever made this kept the real 14-foot strip underneath it. He traced the edge with his pencil. They knew where the recorded easement was. Then somebody drew a bigger corridor around it. That cold feeling returned. Patricia hadn't invented a completely imaginary location. She had taken something real and stretched it until it became useful. Can they do that? Not by drawing it on prettier paper. I almost laughed. Almost. Harold reached for the compliance order. 21 days? That's what they gave me. And they're threatening court enforcement, apparently. His expression hardened. Then don't treat this like neighborhood nonsense. He walked to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder thick with old survey notes. I want to verify the original monuments before I tell you anything under my name. If they're still where they should be, I'll certify what the record says. When? Tomorrow morning. I nodded. Before leaving, I asked him one more question. If the HOA only has 14 feet for drainage, why would somebody create a 30-foot lane? Harold looked down at Patricia's map again. 14 feet gets a maintenance crew to a culvert. He slid his pencil across the wider shaded strip. 30 feet gets you something else. What? He shook his head. That's what I'd be asking. I drove home with certified copies of the recorded plat on the passenger seat. By the time I reached the ranch, the 21-day order didn't scare me anymore. The map did, because Patricia Monroe hadn't simply claimed authority she didn't have. Somebody had taken a legitimate 14-foot drainage easement and deliberately transformed it on paper into a 30-foot corridor across Mercer Ranch. And if Harold was right, the extra 16 feet weren't there by accident. They were there because somebody needed them. Harold was at my eastern pasture before 7 the next morning. He came in an old Ford with survey equipment in the bed and 40 years of county knowledge behind his eyes. We started at the southern corner, where he located an iron monument buried beneath 6 inches of packed dirt. Original pin, he said, right where it's supposed to be. The second monument told the same story, so did the third. By 10, there wasn't much left to argue about. My old cattle fence wandered a few inches in places, the way old ranch fences do, but it never crossed onto Cedar Ridge property. More important, Patricia's blue marks sat well inside Mercer Ranch. Harold drove temporary stakes along the recorded boundary and photographed each one beside his equipment display. I'll prepare the certification, he said. Until then, don't move their blue stakes. Why leave them? Because right now they're evidence. That afternoon, I placed 6 heavy livestock panels several feet inside my property. They weren't meant to establish a new boundary. I needed something temporary while I decided how to replace the aging eastern fence. I photographed those too: location, measurements, timestamps. My father used to tell me memory was useful until money got involved. Then you wanted paper. 2 mornings later, I drove toward the eastern pasture and hit the brakes. The panels had moved, all 6. Someone had dragged them west, deeper into my ranch. Fresh scars cut through the dirt where the steel feet had scraped across the ground. I got out slowly. The blue stakes were different too. 3 had been pulled and reset near the original position of my livestock panels. For a few seconds, I just stood there. There are things a rancher expects to find disturbed overnight. Gates after a storm, wire after cattle lean on it, equipment after high wind. Boundaries don't move themselves. I took out my phone. Pictures first, then video. I walked the entire section without touching anything. One set of tire tracks entered from the Cedar Ridge side, near the drainage strip. Another curved toward the panels. I called Sheriff Daniel Price. He arrived 40 minutes later in a county SUV, stepped out, and looked from the scrape marks to the blue stakes. "You touch anything?" "No." "Good." Daniel wasn't interested in speeches. That was one reason I trusted him. He photographed the tracks, measured the moved panels, then compared their current position to the pictures I'd taken 2 days earlier. These were definitely farther east. I showed him the time-stamped photographs. His expression changed. "Anybody besides Harold know you put them there?" Anyone watching from Cedar Ridge? Daniel crouched beside one of the relocated blue stakes. "This soil's fresh," I noticed. He stood. "You got cameras here?" "Not on this section yet." "Get some." I looked toward the subdivision. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking I don't know who moved your property. And neither do you. That's all I'm putting in a report until we have proof." "Fair enough." Then he pointed toward the stakes. "Don't pull those. They're on my land, I know. But if this turns into litigation, I want the court to see what they did, where they put it, and when." That word landed differently. Litigation. Patricia's 21-day deadline had felt like intimidation. Now Sheriff Price was talking as if this could become a real property case. Daniel walked the tire tracks toward the drainage area. He stopped where the ground narrowed near the culvert. "This the 14-foot easement Harold mentioned?" "That's it." He looked west toward the moved panels. "And their proposed 30 feet goes out there. 16 feet farther onto me." Daniel nodded once. "Document everything from now on." "I already started." "Good. Keep every letter, every photograph, every call. If somebody comes onto the ranch, don't get into a shouting match. Record what you legally can and call us." He looked at the panels again. People get careless when they think they're entitled to something. After he left, I installed 2 cellular cameras facing the eastern line. Then I went inside and opened a fresh notebook. On the first page I wrote, "Mercer Ranch, Eastern Boundary Evidence Log." Underneath, I entered the date Patricia first appeared, the blue paint, the compliance order, Harold's measurements, the moved panels, the reset stakes, Sheriff Price's report number. By the time I finished, anger had burned down into something more useful. Discipline. Patricia wanted me reacting to her deadlines. I wasn't going to. From that point forward, every move they made would leave a record. Just before dark, I drove back to the fence. The temporary panels were still sitting where somebody had dragged them. Beyond them, the roofs of Cedar Ridge caught the last light. I finally understood what bothered me most. Someone wasn't merely claiming my boundary was wrong. They were physically moving objects, resetting markers, and creating a new line on the ground that matched the false line on Patricia's map. It looked less like confusion every day. It looked like preparation. And I still didn't know what Patricia Monroe was preparing for. I decided to stop giving her anything vague to argue about. Harold finished his certified survey 2 days later. The monuments matched the county plat. The recorded boundary matched my deed. And the 14-foot drainage easement sat exactly where the old records said it did. So I rebuilt the fence, not on the questionable edge, not across the drainage easement. I placed the new line several feet inside Mercer Ranch, steel pipe posts, heavy cattle panels, numbered survey markers tied back to Harold's certified coordinates. Where the 14-foot easement reached the culvert, I left legitimate access intact and installed a maintenance gate. Private ranch. Drainage easement access only, no general vehicle access. I mounted cameras where nobody approaching that gate could miss them. If Patricia wanted to argue about boundaries now, she'd have to argue against steel, survey monuments, county records, and video. Harold inspected the finished line. You gave them more clearance than the document requires. On purpose, he nodded. Smart. I looked towards Cedar Ridge. Now let's see what they actually wanted. I didn't wait long. The next morning, one of my cameras sent an alert at 8:16. Two white work trucks were parked near the maintenance gate. Behind them sat a mini excavator. I was there in minutes. Grant Keller stood beside the gate wearing work boots and a Cedar Ridge polo. I recognized him from the HOA website, vice president, owner of Keller Landscape Services. Two workers waited near the excavator. Grant raised a hand. Wade. Glad you're here? I doubt that. He pointed toward the gate. We're scheduled for corridor clearing. What corridor? The HOA maintenance corridor. You mean the 14-foot drainage easement? His expression tightened. We have authorization for the full service area from Patricia, from the association. I pulled a copy of Harold's survey from my truck. 14 feet. Culvert maintenance only. Grant barely looked at it. We've got our own documents. Your documents are wrong. One worker shifted uncomfortably. Grant lowered his voice. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I'd heard almost the same words from Patricia. What are you clearing, brush? Access obstructions. I looked at the ground. The legal drainage strip was already clear. What obstruction? Grant pointed through my new fence toward open pasture. That area. There it was. Not the culvert, my ranch. No. His face hardened. We're doing this with or without you. I took out my phone. Then I'm calling Sheriff Price. Grant laughed once. Call whoever you want. The operator started the excavator. I stepped away. No blocking him. No grabbing equipment. No shouting. I started recording. Grant unlocked the outer access point with an HOA key, and the excavator entered the legitimate drainage strip. For 30 feet. Everything they did was arguably within the easement. Then Grant pointed west. The operator turned. The machine crossed Harold's numbered boundary marker and rolled onto Mercer Ranch. I called Daniel. Sheriff, they're across the surveyed limit. We're coming. The excavator had moved less than 50 yards when county vehicles appeared. Daniel got out and raised one hand, shut the machine down. The engine died. Suddenly, the whole place was quiet. Grant walked toward him. Sheriff, we're authorized to maintain this corridor. Daniel pointed at Harold's marker. Does your authorization include land west of that? We dispute where the corridor ends. I don't. Harold's truck arrived minutes later. I'd called him after Daniel. He unfolded the certified survey across my tailgate. Grant tried to argue that Cedar Ridge possessed historic access. Harold pointed toward the culvert. You have access to that. Then he pointed at the excavator sitting inside my pasture. You don't have access to this. Patricia arrived while deputies were photographing the tracks. She stepped from her SUV and took in the scene without saying anything for several seconds. Then she looked at me. You're making this much harder than it needs to be. I stared back. For who? She didn't answer. Daniel instructed Grant to remove the equipment along the same route it entered and told Patricia any further disputed entry should go through lawyers, not contractors. While one deputy photographed the excavator, Grant opened the rear door of his truck looking for paperwork. A roll of engineering sheets shifted against the seat. One slid halfway out. I only saw it for a few seconds, but I saw enough. Across the title block, in large printed letters, were 5 words: Cedar Ridge North, temporary construction access. I photographed it from where I was standing. Grant noticed. He shoved the plan back inside and slammed the door. That reaction told me almost as much as the title. The excavator hadn't come to maintain a culvert. Patricia hadn't been fighting me over drainage, and that fake 30-foot corridor hadn't been drawn just to move an old cattle fence. Somebody was planning something called Cedar Ridge North. And whatever it was, they needed a construction route straight through my ranch. Then Patricia went silent. No certified letters, no compliance notices, no contractors at the fence. For nearly 2 weeks, Cedar Ridge Estates acted like the fight had never happened. That bothered me more than the threats. My father used to say pressure didn't disappear without a reason. Sometimes it backed off because you won. Sometimes it backed off because somebody had found another way around you. I wasn't ready to assume which one this was, so I called Megan Foster. Megan was a land use attorney in Austin who had handled ranch access and development disputes across central Texas. Harold recommended her after hearing about the excavator. She arrived the next afternoon with a laptop, 2 legal pads, and none of the polished sympathy I expected from a city lawyer. She studied the compliance order first, then Patricia's 30-foot map, then Harold's certified survey, then the photograph I'd taken of the engineering sheet. When she reached that one, she stopped. "Cedar Ridge North," she said. "You know it? No. But I know what temporary construction access means. So do I." She looked at me. "Do you?" I waited. "It means somebody expects heavy equipment, delivery trucks, concrete, utilities, grading. You don't label a route like that unless you're planning to move a lot more than a landscaping crew." That put a different weight on the picture. Megan opened the county planning portal and started searching. Cedar Ridge North didn't show up under the HOA. It showed up under a development company, Brooks Land Development LLC principal, Evan Brooks. She clicked through a preliminary filing. A site plan loaded, 72 proposed homes, new internal streets, stormwater infrastructure, and a northern parcel that sat beyond the existing Cedar Ridge development like a second block waiting to be connected. Megan zoomed out. There, the problem was obvious. A seasonal creek cut across the eastern side of the proposed expansion. The western approach ran into private ranch land. My ranch land, the cheapest route from the county road to the new development, would cut along the very strip Patricia had been trying to redefine. I leaned closer. Can they build another access road? Probably. Then why mine? Because probably costs money. She pointed to the creek crossing, bridge work, drainage review, additional engineering, maybe environmental permitting, maybe utility relocation. Then she tapped the edge of Mercer Ranch. This route is already near grade and close to the existing subdivision. If they could turn your drainage easement into a 30-foot service corridor, construction gets a lot easier. The room went quiet. Suddenly, Patricia's behavior made sense. The fake boundary map, the blue survey paint, the moved livestock panels, Grant's excavator. They weren't trying to prove an old fence was misplaced. They were trying to create enough uncertainty to make my land look usable. "How long has this project been filed?" I asked. Megan checked the dates. Preliminary submission was 7 weeks before your first compliance order. That hit harder than I expected, so they knew about the expansion before they ever contacted me. Looks that way. And Patricia called it a safety issue. Megan closed the laptop halfway. Knowing motive and proving motive are 2 different things. That brought me back down. What do we have? We have a suspicious timeline, a false-looking map, trespass, equipment crossing the recorded easement, and a development plan that benefits from the exact land they're pressuring you over. That's not enough? It's enough to make me interested. She reopened the laptop. It's not enough to make a judge conclude the HOA campaign was coordinated with Evan Brooks. I thought about Patricia standing at my gate. Old fences aren't always legal fences. She hadn't been warning me. She had been setting the stage. Megan began making a list. We need HOA meeting records, survey invoices, communications with Brooks Land Development, anything referring to access, expansion, drainage, corridor width, or Mercer Ranch. Can we get that? Some of it may be public. Some of it may require discovery if they sue or if we seek an injunction. I looked toward the eastern pasture through the kitchen window. The new steel fence stood where Harold had certified it belonged. Beyond it, Cedar Ridge looked quiet. Too quiet. What happens now? Megan capped her pen. Now we stop treating Patricia like a confused HOA president. What do we treat her like? Someone whose actions may be serving a development deal. That afternoon, I added the Cedar Ridge North filing to my evidence log. Project date, developer name, 72 homes, proposed access location. For the first time, I understood what was at stake. Patricia wasn't trying to take 16 feet because she cared about a fence. 16 feet was only useful if it connected to something bigger. And somewhere between Cedar Ridge Estates and Evan Brooks' 72 planned homes, somebody had decided Mercer Ranch was the easiest piece to sacrifice. The only thing Megan couldn't yet prove was whether Patricia had made that decision with him. The first person to help us prove it wasn't a lawyer. It was one of Patricia's own homeowners. 3 nights after Megan found the Cedar Ridge North filing, my phone rang just after 8. Is this Wade Mercer? Yes, my name is Lisa Parker. I live in Cedar Ridge. Her voice was low. I think you need to know what Patricia's been telling us. I sat down. I'm listening. Lisa said Patricia had spent weeks telling residents that I was blocking drainage access and creating a potential flooding hazard. According to her, the board needed emergency legal authority because an uncooperative adjacent landowner refused to respect Cedar Ridge's recorded rights. That landowner was me. People believed her, Lisa said. I did at first. What changed? The excavator. She'd seen Sheriff Price stop Grant Keller's crew. Then she'd watched Harold point out the real easement. That wasn't what Patricia told us would happen. She said the county supported the HOA's corridor. They don't. I know that now. Lisa asked to meet somewhere away from Cedar Ridge. The next morning, Megan and I met her at a diner outside town. Lisa was 43, composed, and nervous enough to check the parking lot twice before sitting down. She placed a folder between us. I shouldn't have copies of everything in here. Megan didn't touch it yet. Were you legally given access to these records as a homeowner? Most of them, yes. They're board packets and meeting materials. Good. Tell us what matters. Lisa opened the folder. Patricia started talking about expansion access before she ever mentioned your fence. That got my attention. How long before? Maybe 2 months. She showed us minutes from a Cedar Ridge board meeting. Most of it was ordinary HOA business, pool repairs, landscaping, insurance, then one line, discussion of north expansion access, closed session to follow. Another packet showed a payment to a private survey company. Megan checked the date. This was before Wade received his first compliance order. Lisa nodded. There are more. A second invoice listed Western Corridor Review. A third showed payment to Grant Keller's landscaping company for preliminary access assessment. I felt my jaw tighten. Grant wasn't just an HOA vice president. His company was being paid while he helped push the corridor claim. Did homeowners approve this? I asked. Not specifically. We were told it was drainage work. Megan photographed each page. Anything connecting this directly to Brooks' land development? Lisa hesitated. Not directly. But there's something else. She pulled out minutes from an executive session summary. One sentence had been highlighted. Expansion access issue must be resolved prior to developer closing. Nobody spoke for a moment. There it was. Not proof of every detail, but close enough to change the shape of the case. I looked at Lisa. Were residents told there was a developer closing? No. Were you told Cedar Ridge North needed my land? No. What were you told? That you were blocking emergency drainage? The anger came slowly. Not at Lisa, at the method. Patricia had used homeowners' fear of flooding to make me the villain, while spending their money on a development access problem they hadn't been told existed. Megan turned another page. Her finger stopped. What is this? Near the bottom was a short notation. Council to review Mercer Agreement for continuing access rights. I leaned forward. Mercer Agreement? Lisa nodded. That's why I finally called you. Patricia mentioned it at the last meeting. What did she say? That Cedar Ridge had an old agreement with your family, and that once council confirmed it, your fence wouldn't matter. I searched my memory. My father had kept decades of ranch paperwork, but I'd never seen anything called the Mercer Agreement. Megan's expression had changed too. Did Patricia describe it? Only that it was old. Something from when Cedar Ridge was first planned. Did she have a copy? I don't know. Megan closed the folder. For the first time since she'd taken the case, she looked genuinely excited. If that agreement created the drainage easement, it may define exactly what Cedar Ridge can and cannot do. Lisa looked worried. Did I just make things worse? No, I said. You made them clearer. She exhaled. I don't want my dues paying people to take somebody else's land. That sentence stayed with me. This wasn't Mercer Ranch against every person in Cedar Ridge. Most of those people had been given a story and trusted the person telling it. Patricia had counted on that. Back at the ranch, Megan searched the county index for the agreement, but the oldest digital records were incomplete. We can request archived copies, she said. I barely heard her. I was thinking about my father's safe. Thomas Mercer saved everything: old cattle contracts, mineral notices, tax receipts, survey sketches, documents I hadn't opened since we buried him. I looked toward the hallway where the safe sat behind my office door. For 3 years, I'd avoided digging through those boxes because every piece of his handwriting made the house feel empty again. Now one of those papers might be the reason Patricia believed she could cross my land. And if my father had signed something with Cedar Ridge's original developer 28 years ago, there was a good chance he'd kept his copy. The question was whether that old agreement gave Patricia the right she claimed, or whether she'd just pointed us toward the document that could take it away. Rain hit the ranch that night, not enough to flood anything, but hard enough to drum against the metal roof while I stood in my office staring at my father's safe. I hadn't opened the lower drawer since Thomas died. The top held current deeds, insurance papers, tax records. The bottom was still his world. I unlocked it. The first box held cattle receipts. The second held mineral correspondence and old equipment titles. Beneath those were envelopes covered in my father's block handwriting. Every few pages brought him back. A note about a washed-out crossing, a receipt for fence posts, a hand-drawn pasture measurement with one corner corrected twice. Thomas trusted records because memory changed and paper didn't. Nearly an hour passed before I found a thin brown envelope wedged beneath a stack of tax maps. 3 words were written across it: Cedar Ridge, do not discard. I sat down. Inside was a 6-page agreement dated 28 years earlier. Thomas Mercer was listed as landowner. The other signature belonged to the developer who originally built Cedar Ridge. I called Megan. I found it. Don't mark anything. Don't staple it. Photograph every page exactly where it is. I know. And Wade? Yeah? Read me the granting language. I started at the first paragraph. The agreement allowed a 14-foot strip along the eastern edge of Mercer Ranch for one purpose: emergency inspection, clearing, repair, and maintenance of the subdivision stormwater culvert. Nothing about a community road. Nothing about general vehicle access. Nothing about 30 feet. I kept reading. Then I stopped. What? Megan, listen to this. The next section prohibited enlargement of the easement beyond 14 feet without written approval from the Mercer landowner. The section after that prohibited conversion to a public or private roadway. Then came the language that made me sit straighter. No access granted herein shall be utilized for construction traffic, commercial development access, subdivision expansion, or service to subsequently developed parcels without the prior written consent of grantor or grantor's successors. Megan was silent. You still there? Yes, keep going. Page 5 contained an enforcement clause. If the easement holder knowingly exceeded the permitted purpose, the Mercer owner could seek injunctive relief, damages, and judicial restrictions necessary to prevent continued misuse. I read it twice. Patricia had spent weeks acting as though an old agreement gave Cedar Ridge broad authority over my ranch. My father had written the opposite into the document. Not approximately, not ambiguously, exactly. Traffic, subdivision expansion, future parcels, the three things Cedar Ridge North needed. Megan finally spoke. Your father anticipated future development. He didn't trust developers, apparently with good reason. I looked at Thomas's signature. For 3 years, the papers in that safe had felt like pieces of a life I couldn't get back. Now one of them felt almost like a hand on my shoulder, not rescuing me, just reminding me he'd done his part. My turn was to do mine. Megan arrived the next morning. We photographed the agreement, scanned it, and compared it to the county plat. The easement description matched Harold's 14-foot corridor. Perfectly. This is why Patricia keeps mentioning historic access, Megan said. She thinks this helps her. Maybe she read the first page and stopped. What if she read all of it? Megan looked at me. Then our problem gets more interesting. She placed the agreement beside Lisa's meeting minutes. On one side, Mercer agreement, continuing access rights. On the other, expansion access issue must be resolved prior to developer closing. Then she added the photograph of the Cedar Ridge North construction access plan. 3 documents, 1 story. They knew an agreement existed, Megan said. They were discussing developer access, and their contractors crossed beyond the exact limits this agreement establishes. So what do we do? Until yesterday, we were proving your fence didn't violate their rights. She tapped my father's agreement. Now we have evidence they may have violated yours. That was the first real reversal. For weeks, Patricia had controlled the language. Violation, compliance, correction, enforcement. Every letter put me in the position of defending myself. That ended at my father's safe. Megan started outlining the next steps. Preservation notices, formal demands for communications between Patricia, Grant Keller, and Evan Brooks, invoices, survey instructions, engineering correspondence, anything discussing Mercer Ranch or Cedar Ridge North. And an injunction, she said. Against what? Any use of that easement beyond drainage maintenance. If they try sending another excavator through, we ask the court to stop them. I looked toward the eastern pasture. Rainwater still clung to the new steel fence, and beyond it, the drainage strip remained open exactly as the agreement required. I'd never blocked Cedar Ridge's legitimate right. Patricia had simply wanted a larger one. My father had understood something 28 years earlier that Patricia apparently hadn't. An easement wasn't ownership, permission wasn't possession, and a narrow right, granted for one purpose, couldn't become a development road just because somebody with an HOA title wanted it to. Megan gathered the copies. From here on, Wade, we stop answering their story. What do we do instead? We make them answer ours. For the first time since I found blue paint in my pasture, I wasn't waiting to see what Patricia Monroe would do next. We were going to force her to explain what she'd already done. Megan moved fast. By noon the next day, preservation notices went to Patricia Monroe, Grant Keller, Cedar Ridge Estates, and Evan Brooks. They were instructed to preserve emails, texts, invoices, survey instructions, engineering plans, meeting records, and every communication mentioning Mercer Ranch, the drainage easement, or Cedar Ridge North. Megan also sent formal notice that any use of the 14-foot easement beyond legitimate culvert maintenance would trigger an immediate request for an injunction. Patricia's response arrived through an attorney. 3 pages, polished language, no answers. The HOA denied wrongdoing and claimed it was merely attempting to clarify historic access rights. Megan read the phrase aloud. That's useful. How? They've stopped calling it a safety violation. She put the letter beside Patricia's original compliance order. Stories change when evidence gets uncomfortable. Then the invoices started filling in the gaps. Lisa obtained additional financial records available to Cedar Ridge homeowners. One payment went to the private survey company that produced Patricia's expanded corridor map. Another went to Keller Landscape Services, Grant's company. The description read, "Preliminary corridor preparation." The invoice predated the excavator incident. I stared at it. He voted on this? According to the minutes, Megan said, Grant participated in the meeting approving the expenditure. An HOA vice president had helped authorize association money to his own company for work connected to a corridor across my ranch. But the strongest records came after Megan prepared our injunction filing. Evan Brooks responded first. He sued. Brooks Land Development claimed the historic easement included implied vehicle access and accused my new steel fence of interfering with long-established development rights. I read that line twice. Development rights? Megan almost smiled. That's a gift. He's suing me. Yes, doesn't feel like a gift. He just put development access at the center of the dispute. Now we get discovery. That was the moment I understood why Megan had been so patient. Patricia had spent weeks threatening court because she assumed legal pressure would scare me into moving the fence. Now Evan had actually opened the courthouse door, and every claim he made gave Megan a reason to demand the records behind it. The first production arrived electronically. Hundreds of pages. Most were useless. Engineering revisions, budget tables, drainage calculations. But one set of plans identified the western edge of Mercer Ranch as preferred temporary construction entrance. Another showed estimated savings if that route became available. Megan circled the figure. They had alternatives. How much? Enough that your route mattered. That explained the pressure. They didn't need my land because Cedar Ridge North was impossible without it. They wanted my land because building somewhere else cost more. Then we found Grant's name in correspondence with Evan's engineering consultant. Grant had discussed vegetation removal, equipment turning radius, and the width necessary for construction vehicles near the drainage strip. The dates were before Grant ever stood at my gate pretending his excavator was there to clear a culvert. My anger sharpened, but it didn't surprise me anymore. Every lie had become a document. Every document had a date. Every date moved backward toward Patricia's first threat. Megan built a timeline across the conference room wall. Cedar Ridge North preliminary submission, private survey invoice, Grant's corridor assessment, blue markings on Mercer Ranch, Patricia's compliance order, moved livestock panels, excavator entry. It wasn't random, it was sequence. Then, late on a Friday afternoon, Megan called. Her voice was different. Come to the office. What happened? Another production came in, from the HOA from Brooks. I drove straight there. Megan had one email open on her monitor. I could see Evan Brooks's name at the top, and Patricia Monroe's below it. Before you read this, she said, look at the date. 7 weeks before Patricia came to my ranch, before the blue paint, before the compliance order, before she ever told me my fence might be illegal. The subject line read, Mercer Access, Closing Timeline. I felt the room narrow around that screen. What does it say? Megan leaned back. Read it yourself. I moved closer. Evan's message was short. He wasn't discussing drainage. He wasn't discussing safety. He wasn't discussing an old cattle fence. He was asking Patricia Monroe how quickly Cedar Ridge could secure enough usable width along Mercer Ranch to protect the development closing. And underneath his question was Patricia's reply. One sentence, a sentence written before she ever stood on my porch, and told me old fences weren't always legal fences. A sentence that was about to explain the entire fight. The final hearing came months later. By then, the blue paint had faded from my pasture, but every photograph, invoice, survey coordinate, and email had been preserved. Judge Rebecca Collins entered the courtroom at 9 sharp. Patricia sat behind her attorney. Grant Keller sat 2 seats away. Evan Brooks was at the opposite end of their table. None of them looked at me. Megan did not begin with Patricia's email. She began with the land. This case becomes simple, she told Judge Collins, if we follow the documents in the order they existed. First came the original county plat. Harold Bennett took the stand and identified the subdivision boundary and the 14-foot emergency drainage easement. Does that easement create a roadway? Megan asked. No. Does it grant Cedar Ridge 30 feet? No. Does it authorize construction traffic serving future development? No. Then Megan displayed Patricia's map, 30 feet, extended north, labeled Community Service Lane. Harold studied it. Is that corridor supported by the recorded survey? No. Could this difference reasonably be explained as a normal surveying error? Harold shook his head. The recorded 14-foot strip is still visible in the underlying geometry. Somebody expanded around it. The courtroom went still. Next came the physical evidence. My photographs of the livestock panels before they were moved. Sheriff Price's photographs afterward, the fresh blue stakes, the excavator tracks crossing beyond the easement, the numbered markers on my new fence. Daniel testified that Grant's machine had entered Mercer Ranch after leaving the lawful drainage strip. Their attorneys tried to turn everything into misunderstanding. Then Lisa Parker testified. She explained what Cedar Ridge homeowners had been told. Flooding, safety, emergency drainage. Then Megan showed the board minutes. Expansion access issue must be resolved prior to developer closing. Lisa looked toward Patricia. We were never told our money was being used to solve access for another development. The next exhibit was Grant's invoice. Preliminary corridor preparation, then the engineering drawing, preferred temporary construction entrance. By that point, nobody was talking about neighborhood safety anymore. But Megan still hadn't shown the most important document. She placed my father's agreement on the screen. Thomas Mercer's signature appeared at the bottom. For a second, I forgot the courtroom. I saw my father's desk, his block handwriting, that brown envelope. Then Megan read the restrictions. 14 feet, drainage maintenance only, no widening, no roadway conversion, no construction traffic, no future subdivision use without written Mercer consent. Evan's attorney argued that historic maintenance vehicles created broader implied access. Judge Collins interrupted. Counsel, how does customary maintenance override an express prohibition on subdivision construction traffic? He didn't have a good answer. Megan returned to the timeline. Cedar Ridge North had been submitted 7 weeks before Patricia contacted me. The private survey was ordered before the first compliance notice. Grant's company was paid before the excavator arrived. Then Megan looked toward Patricia, and now we reach the reason those dates matter. The email appeared, from Evan Brooks, to Patricia Monroe. Subject, Mercer Access, closing timeline. Megan read Evan's question. Can the ranch boundary be pushed back enough to establish practical access before closing? Nobody moved. Then she highlighted Patricia's response. 4 words. We're working the compliance angle first. Silence, not courtroom quiet. Something heavier. The kind that comes when everyone understands the same thing at once. I remembered Patricia at my porch, the leather folder, the calm smile, the warning about old fences. None of it had started with my fence. The fence was simply what they planned to use against me. Megan let the email remain on the screen. Your Honor, the HOA did not discover a compliance problem and later learned that a developer might benefit from solving it. The developer identified the access problem first. The HOA's compliance campaign followed. Patricia's attorney stood. The phrase is being taken out of context. Judge Collins looked at him, then provided the context. He started explaining general drainage concerns. Megan handed him another exhibit, an email attachment from the same chain showing Cedar Ridge North's construction route. Judge Collins read it herself. Then she looked directly at Patricia. The expression on Patricia's face had changed. Not panic, recognition. She finally understood that every piece of authority she'd tried to use against me had been replaced by a record she couldn't control. The judge removed her glasses. I have heard enough on the factual sequence. My hands tightened once around the edge of the table. Megan sat beside me without celebrating. Nobody on our side smiled. Because the fight wasn't over until the order was entered. Judge Collins looked down at my father's agreement, then at the false 30-foot corridor, then back toward Cedar Ridge's table. The court will issue its ruling, and for the first time since Patricia Monroe marked my pasture blue, she wasn't the person deciding where the line belonged. Judge Collins looked down at the exhibits. Mercer Ranch is not subject to the authority of Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. Nobody moved. The recorded easement is 14 feet wide and limited to storm drainage inspection, clearing, repair, and maintenance. The claimed 30-foot community service lane has no support in the recorded instruments. Tricia stared straight ahead. Judge Collins continued, "The easement does not authorize subdivision access, general construction traffic, widening, or service to subsequently developed parcels without consent of the Mercer property owner." That ended Evan Brooks's argument, but the judge wasn't finished. She found that the excavator entry exceeded the recorded easement, and that the evidence showed Cedar Ridge's compliance campaign had been used to advance an access objective unrelated to drainage maintenance. A permanent injunction would prohibit Cedar Ridge Estates, Brooks Land Development, and their contractors from using Mercer Ranch for Cedar Ridge North construction or expansion access. Future legitimate drainage entry would be restricted. Advance notice when circumstances allowed. Identified maintenance personnel, equipment limited to what actual culvert work required. No widening, no developer traffic, no pretending 14 feet meant 30. Then came the money. Cedar Ridge and Brooks Land Development were ordered to reimburse my survey expenses, documented fence-related costs, and substantial attorney fees tied to the improper access claims. It wasn't a lottery ticket. It wasn't supposed to be. It was the cost of forcing me to defend rights they should have respected from the beginning. Evan leaned toward his attorney. Patricia didn't move. Judge Collins looked directly at their table. An easement is a limited property right. It is not ownership. It does not become broader because broader access would be commercially convenient. That sentence mattered more to me than the money. Megan touched my arm once. We'd won. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting, but I didn't have much to give them. One asked whether I felt vindicated. I feel like my fence is where it belongs. Another asked what I thought Patricia should do next. That isn't my decision. Megan and I walked to my pickup. Only when the courthouse doors were behind us did I finally breathe like the fight was over. The consequences moved quickly. Without Mercer Ranch as a construction route, Evan had to redesign Cedar Ridge North around the seasonal creek. The project wasn't killed, but the cheap access plan was. That seemed fair to me. Build your houses if the law allows it. Just don't build your road through somebody else's land because it's cheaper. Inside Cedar Ridge, the fallout was worse. Homeowners learned their dues had paid for survey work connected to a corridor the HOA didn't own. They saw Grant Keller's invoices. They saw the meeting minutes. Eventually, they saw Patricia's email. Patricia lost the presidency before the next regular board cycle. Grant resigned. Lisa called me after the replacement board's first meeting. "You're going to like this." "What happened?" "We voted to circulate the recorded property map to every homeowner." I laughed quietly. That's a start. And we adopted a rule requiring legal review before the HOA asserts authority outside its recorded property. That one's even better. There was no celebration at the ranch, no victory banner, no reason for one. A few weeks later, I opened my father's safe again. This time it didn't feel as heavy. I placed the original Cedar Ridge agreement back inside its brown envelope. Cedar Ridge, do not discard. I ran my thumb across Thomas Mercer's handwriting. He hadn't left me instructions for fighting Patricia Monroe. He'd left something better. Clarity. Know what you own. Know what you've agreed to. Keep the paper. Don't confuse somebody else's confidence with somebody else's rights. I closed the safe. Near sunset, I walked the eastern pasture. The new steel fence threw long shadows across the grass. Harold's numbered markers were still visible. Beyond the 14-foot drainage strip stood the first houses of Cedar Ridge Estates. People were grilling in backyards. A dog barked. Someone pushed a stroller along the sidewalk. Ordinary people living ordinary lives. That mattered. They had never been my enemy. Most of them hadn't known what Patricia was doing in their name. The fence hadn't changed that. What the fence changed was ambiguity. Before I built it, Patricia could point at an aging cattle line and talk about historic corridors, maintenance expectations, and uncertain boundaries. After Harold surveyed the land and the steel went in exactly where the law said it could, she had nowhere left to hide the difference between access and ownership. That difference exposed the excavator. The excavator exposed Cedar Ridge North. Cedar Ridge North led to Lisa. Lisa led us to the Mercer Agreement. And my father's agreement led straight to Patricia's emails. I rested one hand on a steel post. For months, I'd thought I was defending a fence. I wasn't. I was defending the idea that ownership still meant something. Even when the person trying to take advantage of you had nicer letterhead, more meetings, and a development plan worth more money than your cattle. The new fence changed everything because it forced the truth into a line nobody could blur anymore. Their homes could stand on their side. My cattle could graze on mine. The drainage easement could still serve the purpose my father agreed to 28 years earlier. Nobody had to lose what they legitimately owned. They only had to stop claiming what they didn't. I looked across the fence as the last light settled over Mercer Ranch. My father had always believed a good boundary wasn't an insult. Now I understood exactly what he meant. A good boundary isn't there to make enemies. It's there so neither side has to pretend it owns the other.
And that's the lessons I keep coming back to from Wade's story. He didn't protect Mercer Ranch by being louder than Patricia, and he didn't solve the problem by turning every disagreement into a personal fight. He measured the plan, kept the records, called the sheriff when the line was crossed, found the arrangement his father had set, and let the evidence speak when it finally mattered. Sometimes standing your ground doesn't mean raising your voice. It means knowing exactly where you stand, keeping your head when somebody raises you, and having the patience to separate what people claim from what the documents actually say. In the end, Wade kept his rent, Cedar Ridge kept his legitimate rent access, and the homeowner finally learned what had been done in their name. Nobody needed to own the other side of that fence, they just needed to respect it. If you believe Wade handled this the right way, type yes in the comments. And if you ever deal with an HOA or property line dispute, or simply had to stand for something your family worked years to research, I'd like to hear your story too. And if story about rangers, land rights, quiet courage, and ordinary people standing up through the law are your kind of stories, consider subscribing. There are more stories ahead, and I'll be glad to have you along for the next one.